Hey guys, this video is very much about a more simplistic reading of the first part of Locke's theory that we have to cover. So our overall goal today is to have a basic introduction to Locke's theory and begin reading some basic points. That's what it should be, begin reading some basic points. Bit of a typo there. So that means that what we're going to do is take a look at how Locke kind of conceived of the nature of the self, or who we are, or our identity, okay? And when we go through that, we have to do three basic things. We need to look at Locke's theory on personal identity, but also Locke's context. So who were his major influences? What was going on at the time of philosophy that really led him to think a certain way about philosophy and about the philosophy of personal identity, and those general kind of big picture questions. If we get that contextual knowledge, we're probably going to understand his actual arguments a bit better, because we will know that he's already made a set of assumptions based on his philosophical context. Okay. The next thing we're going to look at is psychological continuity. Now, if you remember before, when we looked at Locke's kind of objections to Descartes, what Locke was pretty much objecting to was that our identity has to be tied to a particular substance. So if we read Descartes, what we know for sure is that Descartes argued that the identity, or our self, we existed as a thinking thing in the spiritual world, or a lot of spiritual substance. So quite literally, he thought we existed in a thing that wasn't material, but it was still a thing. Some kind of substance that existed separately from the material world. Whereas when we look at Locke, he doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe that at all. He believes that we do have some kind of self. We do have a personal identity, but we don't need a substance for that identity to be tied together. All right, and to get there, to understand how we have this psychological continuity, we need to have a basic understanding of the principle of individuation. So we look at how we individuate ourselves against other objects, and we look at how things that are substances do that, and we look at things that are man or biological humans do that, okay? So I wouldn't expect you to really know what the hell I'm talking about, but what I do want you to do is to give yourself a pretty big score and see how you've gone, okay? Alright, because I'm rushing this, my grammar is bad. Not to see how you've gone, to see how you've started. The next thing I need to do is to get you to draw a picture that represents physical continuity. So if you remember, one of the theories that evolved out of the problem of the ship of Theseus and its different examples, like for instance the problem of the organ donor, would be, are you still the same person if you replace organs? Let's do this as a little bit of a thought experiment. If I took someone's head off and I could foreseeably transplant it onto another body, who is that person? Is that person the body and the mind kind of combined? Are they like a hybrid new identity, or are they still the same person? Well, we know if we were to look at the same body theory, we'd get an argument that says they're completely different, because obviously we wouldn't have that continuity of physical change. We just have one slab of something completely different joined onto something else. But if you remember me drawing a picture of a baby growing up into a boy, growing up into a teenager, growing up into a man, and aging, we can see the relationships of physical continuity there. So I want you to score yourself right now and then do an APK, which looks at physical continuity. All right? Okay, so this time we're not actually going to do any reading. We're just going to build up to the reading. I think that it would be better to do this reading in two short, sharp videos. The reason for that is because I think that an hour-long video is probably a bit too much, and even though I might tell you to go have a break in one of the videos we did before, I don't know how many people actually did. So we're just going to do the moving up until the reading section, and then once this video is finished, we'll do another video where we actually do the reading of the required sections, which will probably take a long time. as they always do. All right. So here's our man Locke, Mr. Locke, Mr. John Locke. And you've got to understand that he's a very, very influential figure. A lot of human rights theory refers to his theory on rights, but when he was writing about rights theory, he pretty much wrote a set of theories that related to rights of the aristocrat and property holders. So he's a kind of aristocratic or bourgeois man here, all right? Not really a champion of the working class, but still a very well-respected philosopher from an empirical point of view. And at the time that he was around, he was influenced mainly by these two guys. We've met Descartes. Hello, Descartes, how are you? But we haven't really met Sir Isaac Newton unless we've done some physics. And Sir Isaac Newton was basically the first man who put together a set of mathematical equations and based on observations that pretty much explained how the universe works from a physical point of view. He was pretty much the father of physics as we know it, and his equations are still used very often in physics to this day, right? Now, what you could understand right now is if this man looked at the world and then used mathematical equations to explain how it worked, he would be a very empirical thinker. This man over here, which we know is how he works, he's a very deductive thinker. So what we'd probably get is a hybrid of some of their approaches, which would be really interesting to see. Okay. So he wrote this essay, which is called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding by John Locke. And the thing we need to understand about this is people are still debating how it is interpreted these days. And that's because when you look at some of the key terms and concepts that he uses, they're very ambiguous. People are interpreting his work in many different ways because he hasn't really gone to the trouble to define all the keywords that he talks about, and one in particular is consciousness. A lot of people have read his work and still don't have an understanding of how he defines consciousness, but it is a key concept needed to understand just about all of his other writing. Okay, so now I'd like you to take a note. And another thing we could probably need to understand it is from a very, very important period of philosophy. I don't think people realize how important the Enlightenment period of philosophy is to basically to today, because without Enlightenment we wouldn't have things like separation of church and state. We probably wouldn't have the same kind of approach to science. We wouldn't have a secular ethics. A lot of things would never have existed to make us the society we are without the Enlightenment period. It is so fundamentally important to the way Western societies function today. And when is this period? This period is between 1650 to 800 as defined in the textbook. Please understand that everything I'm giving you is highly tied to the textbook because I don't want you to get confused. So if I seem like I'm parroting the textbook, that's deliberate. The reason for that is because I want you to have many entry points into the same content. Now, what does the Enlightenment period really value? Well, it's trying to move away from superstition and mysticism. It doesn't want to have these kind of tradition-based approaches to understanding the world. It says what's more important is to use your brain and deductively and empirically think about what is true, what is not, and really use the brain to reason your way through things. And part of this evolution of reason led us to science. So Enlightenment really loves reason and it loves science. And then after the Enlightenment period, we get a Romantic period where people rebel against that. But basically, that's where John Locke is coming from. He wants to use the intellect and the brain to think about things. He doesn't want to rely on tradition, previously held beliefs. He doesn't really want to rely on this thing called mysticism, which is like a different way of knowing the world. He wants to use the intellect and reason through and use his thoughts to arrive at the truth and to use scientific kind of methods of inquiry to get there as well. All right? So two big members of the Enlightenment period are basically Descartes and this other guy called Hobbes. Now, if you remember anything about Descartes, he defined the mind as a thinking thing. And if you remember your Descartes, you know that the self would be in the mind, which is the thinking thing, because I think, therefore I am implies a subject, and the subject is the self, okay? Hang on, guys, I'll be back in a minute, okay? Okay, half an hour later, and making sure that Teen Titans on the telly, I can get back to work. Alright, so, like I said, we know that Descartes thinks about the self as part of the mind, which is in this kind of spiritual substance land, right? But then we have this guy called Hobbes, and Hobbes can be a bit depressing, Hobbes, especially if you read Leviathan, and a little militaristic. But basically his argument is no, basically the self is nothing but material. You know, it's a classic materialist here. And these two guys end up being a bit of an influence, because after having read them, our man here comes up with a bit of a conclusion. Locke kind of likes a lot of the notions of the self that he's talking about here, but he doesn't believe in the kind of deductive way of thinking that Descartes thinks. He kind of rejects deductive thinking. In fact, our man Locke is a very big empiricist. He would much rather look at the experiences of us psychologically and make conclusions based on how we kind of experience the world psychologically, but not using the deductive logic of, you know, tautologies and definitions and implications and stuff like that. So quickly record a note. But on the other hand, he also rejects the kind of material or substance-based look of the self, or understanding of the self, that our man here, Hobbes, has. So he rejects the fact that that the self exists or is a substance, be it material or immaterial. So he kind of rejects that, but he borrows from Hobbes' empiricism, okay? And these are really important things to know, because that helps us understand how he comes to certain conclusions. He uses empirical thinking, not rationalist thinking, but he rejects the materialist ideas of Hobbes and a lot of other materialists. And his argument is that what makes personal identity, what ties everything together, is psychological continuity, right? That is, we don't know what psychological continuity is at the moment, but we're going to get into a deeper definition of that, obviously, when we do the readings. But for a basic understanding of that, psychological continuity is our psychological evolution and change throughout time has some kind of continuity and movement, just like physical continuity. And we did that in the first reading. So the reason why I haven't got a picture of a brain with a mind in it or anything is because I really wanted us to get away from any metaphors that deal with definition of the psychology as anything in a substance, be it material or immaterial. That's why we've got a picture of someone talking to their therapist. And what's really important is that maybe, as I hinted before, when we look at the continuity in personality, continuity in experience or consciousness, that's really where the self resides, not necessarily continuity in a biological sense or continuity in a mind as a substance sense or the soul as a substance sense. Now, we don't need to fully, oh, actually, I'll give you a note. You've got to take this down, right? And you've got to start using visual representations, and you've got to start adding and recording different understandings of things that I've said, all right? What I say is more important usually than what we have up here. So make sure you record the understandings as well as the pictures, as well as the key words. Now, when I read this, I was a bit confused, because whenever we see the word necessary, we think of deductive thinking, but whenever we see the word sufficient, we think of empirical thinking. But for now, we're going to have a look at what is meant by the fact that he claims that psychological continuity it gives us the necessary conditions for the existence of the self and the sufficient conditions for the existence of the self. Anything that is a necessary condition is the condition that a thing must have in order to be that thing. It's its absolute essential features. Anything that is a sufficient condition are conditions that guarantee that something exists or is a certain kind of thing. So this is what I need to have in order to be that kind of thing, and this is what I need to have in order to exist or to be part of an overall category. Okay? Take a note. We don't need to know this really that well. Okay, not yet. Obviously, we're going to develop a deeper understanding of this when we go through the readings. So just keep it in mind. It's a really important way of thinking about the world. Now, we're not going to read paragraphs 1 to 7, but before we start the reading, it's probably essential that we have a basic understanding of what it is that he said beforehand, okay? So the first thing is we look at what he calls individuation. And I love this. Individuation can be defined in a rather what we call synchronic state, what we talked about in the last video. It's basically saying I am this rather than that at this particular place in time, okay? And here I've basically circled the pen to point out that the pen has its own particular existence and can be compared again to something else. And remember I talked about the fact that whenever we talk about identity, it is always a relational term. It's always being talked about or defined in relation to other things, right? So he then goes on to say that from this rather than that, and this is bizarre, he's using a bit of deductive thinking now, isn't he? He's basically saying that something that is the same object cannot exist at the same place in the same time. So Mr. Cat cannot exist here again as himself again. Oh, sorry, no, I got that wrong. I got that wrong. Scrap that. Sorry, because that's this point over here. What he's saying is that something that exists as an individual object cannot exist in two places at the same time, just like Mr. Cat. Okay? Take a note. Then he goes on to argue that two distinct objects or two distinct beings or two distinct individuals that have physical makeup cannot exist in the same place at the same time. So if we put these two people together, this is virtually impossible, right? So there's an individuation happening here. That's happening on a very physical level, right? And when we talk about individuation, he says, well, we've got to start looking at what we call principles of individuation, or the principle of individuation. And when we come up with the principle of individuation, we need to look at how it occurs in three different areas. All right. The first area is what we call substance. And for a better word in a scientific world today, we just say matter. All right. Or we would also say matter, but we'd also say the substance that we could think of as a material, the stuff defined by the soul in Phaedo or the mind in Descartes, right? The next thing we talk about is man, all right? Now, man, here, when he uses the term man, he's actually talking about man as an animal, as a biological creature, all right? And the last thing we need to think about is person. He differentiates between a person and a man, okay? He thinks the two things are very different. So all these three different forms, three different things require a different principle of individuation. And the first thing he looks at is substance. And in this case, we're just going to look at material substance, all right? So here we have a chair, and he argues quite literally that as soon as a substance, as soon as a substance has changed in any way, be it chemical, physical, whatever, as soon as the arrangements of the atoms or molecules in this particular object, the chair, have changed, right, it turns into another thing altogether. And this is his first principle of individuation. As soon as there is a physical rearrangement or chemical rearrangement, I don't know what it is, but some kind of substance change, he would argue that you move to a completely different object. Take a note. Now that seems bizarre to us because we still argue that this chair and that chair is the same, it's just that it's got a broken leg. But one real good way to think about it is he's only talking about substance, not other aspects of identity, and perhaps the chair ontologically could have other forms of identity attached to it in both different forms. But when we talk about the substance, we are essentially saying that we've achieved two different identities here, because we have two completely different arrangements of molecules, matter, etc. Okay. The next thing is looking at man, and when we talk about man, we're talking about man in a biological sense. And his argument is that your individuation is maintained for as long as the arrangement and alignment of cells and all the structures and components of the body are geared towards preserving your life. All right. So he would say that from a point of view of a human animal or a biological creature of any sort, you can maintain your identity as a man or as a woman, or as a biological human, which would be better, as long as you have the biological arrangement to sustain life. Okay? Take a note. Okay, so as I said, all these three different types of existence, form, shape, I don't know what we want to call them, all have different principles of individuation. Anything that is a substance, when we're looking at things at a substance level, basically as soon as the arrangement of molecules or whatever within it changes, bang, you have a different object. You can preserve your identity as a biological animal, in this case as a man, if you have a continuity of physical form that allows you to preserve life, right? Okay. The last thing we're going to look at, and this is the next video, is what about you as a person, not as a biological animal? Well, this is where he says that the continuity needs to be made aware. The point of individuation starts at being a rational, thinking, self-aware self. And that's what we're going to look at in the next video. Right. Can you please take a note? Okay, so if you look at today's video, what have we done? We've had a basic introduction to Locke's theory, and we've begun to read some basic points. We should have a pretty decent understanding of the historical context that's shaping the way that he thinks. We should, if we're quite lucky, we should definitely have an understanding of what he means by psychological continuity. It is basically the tying together of all our psychological aspects, such as personality, consciousness, etc., which allow us then to maintain a sense of identity and self. And now we know that there are different principles of individuation that apply to different things, whether they substances, man, or persons. Okay? So if all that makes sense to yourself, just score yourself, please give yourself a 4 for each of these, because you're pretty much where you need to be. All right, thank you.